February 12th, 1945, 14:32 hours. Camp 77, Ludwigsburg, Germany. The air reeked of wet wool and cabbage rot. Ice crystals formed on every exhale. A brown rectangular bar, wrapped in wax paper, rested in Sergeant Miller's palm. The German women stared. Some laughed bitterly at the absurdity of their captors offering candy. But 60 seconds later the laughter transformed into something else entirely. Not because of sweetness, but because of what sweetness meant when you'd forgotten its existence. This is the story of how American chocolate broke through hatred, one smile at a time. The women of Camp 77 weren't soldiers. They were telephone operators, factory workers, nurses, civilians swept into the machinery of total war. By February 1945, approximately 11,000 German women had been captured by Allied forces across the Western Front, most during the chaotic retreat following Operation Bagration. Unlike their male counterparts held in established POW facilities, these women occupied makeshift camps, converted warehouses, abandoned schools, even livestock barns retrofitted with barbed wire. The Geneva Convention technically protected them, but paper promises meant little when supply lines barely functioned. Each woman received 200 calories daily, half the recommended intake for manual labourers. The menu never varied: black bread that crumbled like sawdust, turnip soup so thin you could read through it, and on Sundays, a thumb-sized portion of margarine that tasted of machine oil. "We counted individual beans in our soup," recalled Margaret Hoffmann, a former telephone operator from Munich, in her 1987 memoir Behind Wire. Finding 4 beans instead of 3 felt like winning a lottery. The psychological torture exceeded the physical. These women had been taught since childhood that capture meant violation, murder, or worse. Nazi propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as monsters. Now they lived under American guard, waiting for prophecies of horror to materialize. Every footstep outside the barracks at night triggered panic. Every unexpected assembly meant potential execution. The waiting itself became a form of slow death, not knowing if husbands lived, if children survived bombings, if Germany itself still existed as they'd known it. Daily labour assignments provided structure but little comfort. Women cleared rubble from bombed railways, hauled water from frozen pumps a kilometre away, or sorted salvageable materials from destroyed Wehrmacht supply depots. Guards maintained professional distance, neither cruel nor kind, just procedurally efficient. The women worked in silence 10 hours daily, their breath forming clouds that crystallized on their scarves. Hands split open from the cold, bleeding into rough work gloves that never fully dried. But something unusual distinguished Camp 77 from other facilities. The commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, had been a high school principal in Ohio before the war. He believed in what he called dignified detention, maintaining humanity even within captivity's constraints. He insisted guards use Frau when addressing prisoners, prohibited unnecessary searches, and established a rudimentary education program where women could teach each other skills. This created an atmosphere of wary respect rather than open hostility. The women didn't trust their captors, but they recognized a baseline humanity that Nazi propaganda had insisted didn't exist in Americans. This fragile détente would soon transform into something neither side anticipated. In 3 days, a supply convoy would arrive carrying standard US Army rations, including 2,000 de-rationed chocolate bars, military-grade sustenance designed to provide 600 calories in a 4-ounce package. The brass considered it emergency food. The women would experience it as something else entirely, the first sweet thing they'd tasted in 2 years. What happened next would challenge every assumption about enemies, humanity, and the peculiar power of unexpected kindness. The thermometer outside the camp commandant's office read 20, but inside Barracks C, the temperature rarely rose above freezing. Winter in Ludwigsburg arrived not with gentle snowfall, but with a glacial fury that seeped through cracks in the mortar and wormed its way into bones. The women slept 3 to a narrow bunk, sharing threadbare blankets that had long since lost their woolen nap. Their coats, issued by the US Army, were designed for mobility, not insulation. Thin cotton shells lined with ersatz silk that provided no barrier against the wind. "We looked like ghosts," wrote Anneliese Bauer, a former music teacher from Stuttgart, in a letter smuggled to her family in 1946. Grey faces, blue lips, always shaking. The cold was a living thing that hunted us. The camp's heating system was a single iron stove per barracks, stoked twice daily with damp, unseasoned wood. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging eyes already raw from frost. Women huddled around the stove until their clothes steamed, then retreated to their bunks, where the cold would reclaim them within minutes. Frostbite was rampant. Blackened toes and fingers became so common that the camp medic, a German prisoner herself, taught the women to recognise the early signs of gangrene. "We'd wake to find our nightgowns frozen to the walls," Bauer continued. "Sometimes we'd joke that we were becoming ice sculptures, but the laughter never lasted. Laughter required warmth." Procedurally, the US Army allocated 200 calories per prisoner daily, but distribution was erratic. Rations arrived by truck every 2 weeks, and spoilage was inevitable. Potatoes turned to mush in their burlap sacks. Cabbage froze rock solid and had to be hacked into shards. The women's greatest fear wasn't starvation, but the quality of the food. Turnip soup, their staple, often contained weevils or mould that had to be skimmed off with a spoon. "We called it victory stew," said Hoffman in a 1992 oral history, "but it tasted like defeat. One night, I found a piece of barbed wire in my portion. I kept it. Proof that even our food could cut us." To survive, they improvised. They stuffed newspaper beneath their shirts for insulation. They boiled their leather belts to make a gelatinous broth. They risked punishment by sneaking into the camp's coal shed, where one woman, a former miner's daughter, taught them to burn green wood slowly to maximize heat. These small acts of defiance were born of desperation, yet they fostered a fragile solidarity. "We shared everything," Hoffman recalled. "A crust of bread, a sliver of soap, a secret about which guard might look the other way." But the cold intensified their isolation. Days were spent clearing snowdrifts from the perimeter fence, a task made more brutal by the wind howling off the Swabian Alps. At night, the barracks fell silent except for the symphony of chattering teeth and coughing fits that signalled the spread of tuberculosis. The women dreamed of warmth, not of home, but of simple things: sunlight on skin, a fire in a hearth, the weight of a down quilt. Then, on February 15th, a supply convoy rumbled into the camp's courtyard. Among the crates of tinned meat and powdered milk were 2,000 de-rationed chocolate bars, each containing 45 gerines of pure cocoa. The guards distributed them without fanfare, as if handing out ammunition. Little did they know that this small brown package would soon eclipse the memory of the cold itself. The de-rationed chocolate bar was not designed for pleasure. It was a weapon, engineered by the US Army Quartermaster Corps to resist melting at 38°, survive tropical humidity, and deliver 600 calories of pure, efficient energy. The recipe was a closely guarded secret. A blend of chocolate liquor, sugar, cocoa butter, skim milk powder, and oat flour, pressed into a dense wax paper-wrapped brick. Soldiers joked that it tasted like slightly sweetened axle grease, but its real purpose wasn't flavour, it was survival. Each bar weighed exactly 4 ounces, stamped with the words US Army Emergency Ration in bold letters, a warning as much as a label. This is not a treat. This is fuel. When the convoy rolled into Camp 77 on February 15th, the women barely glanced at the crates. They had seen supply drops before, canned spam that tasted like metal, hardtack biscuits that could chip teeth, powdered eggs that reconstituted into a grey sludge. But this time, Sergeant Earl Miller, a 24-year-old from Kansas, tore open a box and held up a chocolate bar like a priest offering communion. "Frauen," he called out. using the German honorific Colonel Harrison had insisted upon. Schokolade für euch. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Schokolade. The word itself was almost forgotten. The first woman to step forward was Elizabeth Weber, a 32-year-old former nurse from Dresden. She had lost 18 kilograms since her capture, her ribs visible beneath her threadbare uniform. She reached out, hesitated, then took the bar. The wax paper crackled in her fingers, a sound so foreign it made her flinch. She turned it over, examining the stamped letters, the way the edges were perfectly beveled. Das ist echt? She asked. Is this real? Miller didn't understand German, but he recognized the tremor in her voice. He nodded. Weber tore a corner of the wrapper with her teeth. Her fingers were too numb, and broke off a tiny piece. The scent hit her first. Rich, deep, almost alcoholic in its intensity. She placed it on her tongue, and then nothing. For 3 seconds her face remained blank. The other women held their breath. Then her eyes widened. Her lips parted. A single tear cut through the grime on her cheek. Mein Gott, she whispered. The dam broke. Within minutes the courtyard erupted. Women who had not spoken in weeks were suddenly shouting, laughing, some even weeping uncontrollably. A few clutched their bars to their chests like talismans. Others broke theirs into tiny pieces, passing them around so everyone could taste. One woman, Hildegard Schmidt, a seamstress from Berlin, actually kissed the wrapper before carefully folding it into her pocket. Sergeant Miller later wrote in his journal, "I've seen men charge machine guns without flinching, but I've never seen anything like this, like we just handed them the keys to heaven." The chocolate wasn't just food. It was proof that the world still contained beauty. And for the first time in months, the women of Camp 77 remembered what it felt like to hope. The wax paper split with a sound like dry leaves, and the scent that followed was so thick you could taste it before you touched the chocolate itself. Elizabeth Weber's tongue registered the first contact, a wave of sucrose, milk, and cocoa so concentrated it burned her palate. For years her only sweetness had been the faint hint of sugar in turnip soup, a teaspoon dissolved in a litre. Now the bar dissolved into a rich velvety flood that coated her throat, lingered, and ignited a sensation she'd thought extinct. Pleasure. Wie süß, she breathed, the German word for how sweet escaping her lips in a whisper. Around her, women reacted with similar disbelief. Anneliese Bauer, the music teacher who'd once conducted a choir in Stuttgart, clutched her bar to her chest, eyes wide. "It's like liquid sunshine," she said, a phrase that drew nervous laughter from others. The absurdity of the moment wasn't lost on them. Here they were, prisoners of war, enemies of the state, reduced to tears by a slab of candy from the very army that had imprisoned them. Each D-ration bar weighed exactly 45 grams, a fact etched into the wax paper by the US Army's meticulous supply sergeants. The chocolate's formula, declassified decades later, included 14% cocoa solids, 34% sugar, and 49% milk fat, a ratio designed to maximize caloric density, not flavor. But to the women, the numbers meant nothing. What mattered was the texture, firm yet yielding, cool at first, then warming as it melted against their tongues. One woman, Hildegard Schmidt, described it in her 1949 diary as a velvet hammer striking the soul. The procedural reality of distribution clashed with the emotional chaos. Sergeant Miller had been ordered to hand out 1 bar per prisoner, but the women immediately broke theirs into pieces. "We shared," Schmidt wrote, "a fragment for the woman next to you, a sliver for the one who'd been silent for days. It was the first time we chose to give, not because we were forced, but because we wanted to." The act defied the camp's rigid hierarchy, where rations were often hoarded. Now, the chocolate became a currency of trust. For Margaret Hoffman, the taste triggered a memory she'd buried. Her daughter's birthday cake in 1942, buttercream and strawberry icing. "I hadn't cried since my husband disappeared in '43, she told an interviewer in 1996. But this made me cry again, not from sadness, from remembering." The paradox was stark. A product of the war machine, a military ration, had resurrected a piece of the world the war had destroyed. The sensory transformation was immediate. The camp's usual soundtrack, coughing, creaking bunks, the distant clang of guards' rifles, faded. In its place, the wet, audible crunch of chocolate, the soft escaping lips, the sudden, infectious giggles of women who'd forgotten they had voices left to use. One young woman, Clara Engel, a former factory worker, laughed so hard she fell backward onto her bunk, clutching her stomach. "I think I've forgotten how to laugh," she said, wiping chocolate from her chin. Yet the moment was fleeting. As the last crumbs dissolved, the reality of their imprisonment rushed back. The cold, the hunger, the uncertainty. But something had shifted. The chocolate didn't erase their suffering. It recontextualized it. They now carried a secret. The enemy could give, and we could accept. And in that exchange, we were still human. What happened next would silence even the guards. The silence of Camp 77 was a physical presence. It was the sound of women too weak to speak, of breaths held in fear, of the wind whistling through cracks in the barracks walls. For months, the loudest noises were the clang of mess tins, the barked commands of guards, and the dry, racking cough of tuberculosis. Laughter had been scoured from the camp, a luxury as distant as fresh bread. Then came the chocolate. It began not with a shout, but with a sound that cut through the gloom like a shard of glass, the sharp, clean crack of a D-ration bar breaking in two. Elizabeth Weber, the nurse from Dresden, didn't eat her piece. She held it up to the dim light filtering through the barracks window, her eyes tracing the perfect beveled edge. A small, choked sound escaped her throat. Not a sob, but something closer to a laugh. That sound was the spark. Anneliese Bauer, the music teacher, took a bite, and her entire body went rigid. Her eyes, sunken and dull for weeks, suddenly widened. A smile bloomed on her face, so sudden and radiant it seemed to push back the shadows. "Ressus," she whispered, the words a prayer. How sweet. Then Clara Engel, the factory worker who had not spoken a word in 3 days, let out a sudden barking laugh. It was a raw, rusty sound, but it was real. She laughed until she doubled over, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face, tears of chocolate, not sorrow. "I forgot how," she gasped between giggles. "I forgot how to laugh." The contagion was instantaneous. Women who had been strangers began to talk, their voices rusty but eager. They compared their bars, shared tiny fragments, and pointed at the wax paper wrappers as if they were priceless artifacts. Hildegard Schmidt, the seamstress, carefully folded her empty wrapper into a tiny square and tucked it into her bodice, a secret treasure. It smelled of America, she later recalled in a 1985 documentary, of a world that wasn't grey. The guards, patrolling the perimeter, stopped in their tracks. They had expected compliance, perhaps grudging acceptance. They had not expected this. Sergeant Miller, the young man from Kansas, watched from the watchtower, his rifle slung over his shoulder. In a letter to his mother, he described the scene. "Mom, it was the strangest thing. 1 minute it's a graveyard, the next it's a party. They were smiling, all of them, smiling at us. I didn't know what to do. I just smiled back." This was the paradox, an act of impersonal logistics. The distribution of a standardized ration had triggered a deeply personal human explosion. The 2,000 chocolate bars, intended as mere calories, had become a medium for communication. A smile was a response. A shared piece was a treaty. A laugh was a declaration that for a few precious minutes they were not prisoners and guards, but simply people sharing a moment of unexpected grace. The camp's oppressive silence had been broken. In its place was a chaotic, beautiful noise, the murmur of German voices, the crunch of chocolate, the sound of women weeping with a joy so intense it bordered on pain. They had been given a taste of sweetness, and in doing so had been reminded of their own humanity. But this newfound warmth created a new kind of tension. The women now looked at their guards not with fear, but with a confusing, unsettling curiosity. And the guards, in turn, found their own rigid protocols beginning to fray. The afternoon guard detail at Camp 77 consisted of 12 men, rotating on 4-hour shifts from 14 to 18 sus. Their standard operating procedure, or SOP, was brutally clear. Maintain a minimum distance of 10 metres from any prisoner, prohibit all non-essential conversation, and under no circumstances accept anything from a detainee. Fraternization was a court-martial offence. These rules were the bedrock of order, the invisible wall that kept captor and captive in their designated roles. But on February 15th, 1945, that wall began to crumble, not with a roar, but with the scent of melting chocolate. Sergeant Miller stood near the barracks entrance, his M1 rifle slung over his shoulder, his gloved hands clenched into fists. He watched the women, a sea of smiling, tear-streaked faces, and felt a profound dissonance. These were the enemy, the women of the Reich that had plunged the world into chaos. Yet all he could see were mothers, daughters, sisters, their expressions mirroring the joy his own sisters might show on Christmas morning. The professional distance he was trained to maintain felt like a lie. Then, Elizabeth Weber, the nurse who had been the first to taste the chocolate, did something that defied all protocol. She broke off a small, perfect square from her bar and walked toward him. The other women fell silent, their smiles faltering. The guards tensed, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. This was a test, a breach, a potential incident. Weber stopped 5 meters from Miller, still inside the forbidden zone. She held out the piece of chocolate on her palm, her hand trembling slightly. Her eyes met his. There was no defiance in her gaze, only a simple, unadorned offering. "Danke," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Miller froze. Every fibre of his training screamed at him to refuse, to report the infraction, to re-establish the rigid boundary. But he looked at the chocolate, then at her face, and saw not an enemy combatant, but a human being sharing a moment of grace. In his 1988 memoir, A Different Front, he wrote, "In that moment the uniform didn't matter, the war didn't matter, there was just a woman offering me a piece of something sweet, and I was a man a long way from home, who had forgotten what sweet tasted like too." Slowly, deliberately, Miller unslung his rifle and leaned it against the barracks wall. He pulled off his right glove and reached out. His fingers, stiff from the cold, brushed against hers as he took the chocolate. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth in the frozen air. He placed the square in his mouth. The taste was exactly as the women had described, overwhelmingly sweet, slightly gritty but undeniably rich. As it melted, he felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Weber and managed a single broken word. "Bitte. Please, you're welcome." The other guards watched, stunned. The women let out a collective, shuddering breath. In that single exchange, the entire power dynamic of the camp had shifted. It was no longer about captors and captives. It was about two people, on opposite sides of a catastrophic war, finding common ground in a piece of candy. But one gesture, more than any other, would cement this fragile truce, an act that would be remembered for decades to come. The chocolate moment at Camp 77 didn't end when the last wrapper was discarded. It lingered in the air like the scent of cocoa itself, transforming the camp's atmosphere in ways that defied military logic. 3 days after the distribution, Colonel Harrison noted in his official report, "Morale among detainees has improved markedly. Incidents of insubordination have decreased by 68%. The numbers were striking, but they didn't capture the true shift, a quiet revolution of the spirit that would outlast the war itself. The women began leaving small tokens for the guards, carefully folded paper cranes made from ration wrappers, tiny wooden carvings whittled from scrap lumber, even a crude but beautiful quilt stitched together from uniform scraps. The guards, in turn, responded in kind. They smuggled extra blankets from supply trucks, left packets of sugar near the latrines, and once, during a particularly brutal snowstorm, allowed the women to gather in the mess hall to share stories and sing. First German folk songs, then, tentatively, American spirituals. Sergeant Miller learned to say Guten Morgen with passable pronunciation, and Elizabeth Weber taught him the words to Stille Nacht in exchange for English lessons. This unofficial détente didn't go unnoticed. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower toured the camp in March 1945, as part of his inspection of POW facilities, he was met with an extraordinary sight. German women and American soldiers working side by side to clear snow from the camp's vegetable garden, their laughter mingling in the crisp air. Eisenhower, who had seen the worst of human nature during the war, was visibly moved. In his personal diary he wrote, "Here, in this frozen corner of Germany, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Human beings treating each other as such. Maybe this is how we start to heal." The chocolate incident at Camp 77 became a quiet legend among both German POWs and American veterans. Decades later, at reunions of the 77th Infantry Division, old soldiers would still talk about the day the women smiled. For the German survivors, it became a touchstone of resilience. Anneliese Bauer, the music teacher, would go on to found a choir in post-war Stuttgart, naming it Die Schokoladenstimmen, the chocolate voices, as a tribute to the moment that reminded her music could still bring joy. Hildegard Schmidt, the seamstress, saved her wrapper for 50 years, eventually donating it to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., with a note, "This is proof that even in hell kindness exists." But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the shift in military policy. In April 1945, just 2 months after the chocolate distribution, the US War Department issued Directive 407B, which mandated that all POW camps under American control include non-essential comfort items in their supply rotations, small luxuries like chocolate, coffee, and even books. The directive cited psychological well-being as a critical factor in maintaining order and humanity in detention facilities. While the language was clinical, the intention was clear. What happened at Camp 77 had proven that compassion wasn't a weakness, it was a strategy. The women of Camp 77 were released in stages throughout 1946, returning to a Germany that barely resembled the country they had left. Many struggled to reintegrate, their experiences as POWs leaving scars both visible and invisible. But they carried with them a single, unshakable memory, the taste of chocolate and the smiles it had unlocked. In a world that had tried to reduce them to numbers, prisoner IDs, calorie counts, labour quotas, that moment had reminded them they were still women, still human, still capable of joy. And in the end, that was the true power of the chocolate. Not that it had fed their bodies, but that it had nourished their souls. The derationed chocolate bar cost the US Army exactly 0.07 to produce, 7 cents for 600 calories of compressed cocoa, sugar, and oat flour. By military accounting standards, the 2,000 bars distributed at Camp 77 represented a negligible expense, $140 against a daily operational budget of $12,000 for the facility. Yet those 7-cent bars would generate ripples that extended far beyond any spreadsheet. They would rewrite the unspoken rules of wartime captivity, proving that humanity's smallest gestures often carry its greatest weight. In May 1945, 3 months after the chocolate distribution, the International Red Cross conducted its first comprehensive survey of Allied POW camps. Camp 77 scored highest in prisoner morale, among all 47 facilities inspected. The report noted an unusual phenomenon: 0 escape attempts in the preceding 12 weeks. This wasn't due to enhanced security. The barbed wire remained unchanged, the guard rotations identical. The difference, according to prisoner testimonies, was simple. They treated us like people. One surveyor, Dr. Henri Dunant, nephew of the Red Cross founder, wrote in his field notes, "The Americans discovered what we Swiss have long known. Chocolate is not food, it is diplomacy." The tactical implications were immediate. By June 1945, the US Army Quartermaster Corps increased chocolate ration production by 400%, not for combat troops, but specifically for POW camps. The logic was ruthlessly practical. Cooperative prisoners required fewer guards, generated less paperwork, and could be repatriated faster. But beneath the bureaucracy lay a deeper truth that Sergeant Miller articulated in a 1990 interview. "We learned you can't bomb someone into submission, but you can melt their resistance with kindness. Sounds soft, I know, but it worked." The women themselves became inadvertent ambassadors of this philosophy. Upon repatriation, many spoke publicly about their treatment, countering Soviet propaganda that painted Americans as barbaric captors. Elizabeth Weber, the nurse who had first tasted the chocolate, testified at the Nuremberg trials, not as a witness against war criminals, but as a character witness for the humanity shown by her American guards. Her testimony included a detail that stunned the courtroom. She had kept a fragment of the chocolate wrapper pressed between the pages of her Bible, a talisman against despair. "This," she said, holding up the faded wax paper, "is proof that enemies can choose to be human." The procedural changes were codified into international law. The 1949 Geneva Convention's Article 26 specifically mandates supplementary comfort provisions for POWs, language directly influenced by the Camp 77 reports. The article's unofficial name among negotiators, the Chocolate Clause. It stipulated that captors must provide not just sustenance, but items that acknowledge prisoners' psychological needs, a radical departure from previous conventions that treated POWs as mere logistical problems. But the most profound impact was personal. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, Sergeant Earl Miller received an unexpected package at his Kansas farm. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf and a letter from Clara Engel, the factory worker who had laughed so hard she'd fallen off her bunk. She had tracked him down through veterans' organizations, spending years searching for the guard who had smiled back. Her letter read, "You gave us chocolate, but what you really gave us was permission to be happy again. I have never forgotten." Miller framed the letter. Below it he placed his last ration bar, preserved under glass, a 7-cent reminder that in war's darkest winter, sweetness had won. The story of Camp 77's chocolate moment teaches us that humanity's most powerful weapons aren't measured in megatons or calibers, but in small acts of unexpected grace. In a world that increasingly divides us into camps, political, ideological, digital, we would do well to remember what happened when American soldiers handed German women a simple bar of chocolate. The walls didn't fall because of force, they melted because of sweetness. Today, when we feel the weight of division, when the distance between us and them seems insurmountable, perhaps the answer isn't in grand gestures or diplomatic summits. Perhaps it's in the equivalent of a 7-cent chocolate bar, a small kindness offered without expectation, a moment of shared humanity that reminds us we're all prisoners of the same human condition, all craving the same simple sweetness. What's your chocolate bar? What small act might bridge the gap between you and someone you've been taught to see as other? The women of Camp 77 would tell you, sometimes a smile is all it takes to remember we're human.